Thank you, Liz, and thank you everyone for having me back. I wanted to try and keep this towards survival. It was the main thing that really got me interested in parapsychology way back when, because I was growing up in a place in Nottingham. So it has a vast array of hauntings and claims the two oldest pubs in the world, the Ye Old Trip to Jerusalem and the Salutation Inn. And then only 5 minutes down the road from me is Newstead Abbey, so it's the former home of the poet Lord Byron as well. And that's what really got me interested in hauntings and ghosts, because my grandmother used to take me there and told me the tales of Bosun the dog, which was Byron's own dog that people have seen around the area where his remains were scattered, the White Lady and the Goblin Friar as well. Picturesque location, absolutely beautiful. And as a kid, I just thought, what, people are really having these experiences, that they're actually encountering ghosts and someone's there and then suddenly they're not. And later on, I just thought, well, this is really interesting. Way down my career line, I just thought, well, I could go into psychology. You know, it's a good degree to have. Whatever you want to get into, it's a good fallback. Most jobs are quite pleased if you've got some sort of understanding of social science and how people behave and interact. But then I realized that if I went to particular universities, I could pursue parapsychology within the psychology curriculum, along with looking at all kinds of other things: child psychology, biological psychology, evolutionary psychology, you name it. So let's have a little look through what we're talking about here today. This is the new campus that we're at. I'll explain a little bit more about what parapsychology is. This first talk is mainly going to be on after-death communications, specifically around bereavement as well. That really the main focus of my research in the last 5 or 6 years. We've moved campus recently. This is Waterside campus in the middle of Northampton. It used to be the main depot of the trains coming in and out. Northampton is absolutely famous for leather technology. It produces the Brogue shoes, the leather shoes. It has done for many years, and it's got a proud history of shoemaking. And we still have leather technology as well at the university as one of kind of a popular thing that people travel from all around, especially Thailand, to come and get trained up in leather technology and producing leather. But one of the other things we're famous for is parapsychology. We have within the Faculty of Health and Society a rather large team, probably about 15 members of staff or so, that are involved in parapsychology, transpersonal psychology, consciousness studies and neuroscience, all interested in unusual experiences people have, even though we know they're actually quite common as well. And that's quite unique. There's other universities looking at this, but I think we're one of the strongest research teams really in the world at the moment as far as universities go. So I've mentioned parapsychology. What exactly is it? Well, it can be defined as the scientific study of experiences which, if they are as they seem to be, are in principle outside of the realm of human capabilities as presently conceived by conventional scientists. So this breaks down into 3 domains. Ultimately, we call any type of parapsychological phenomena a psi-based phenomena. They're all encapsulated under this title of psi. But it breaks down into 3 things. ESP, so that's extrasensory perception. That was coined by Joseph Banks Rhine at Duke University in the 1920s or 30s when he was doing experiments with the Zener cards, your star, your cross, your wavy line, your circle, your square. And this has 3 domains within itself. So telepathy, mind-to-mind interaction; clairvoyance, seeing information at distance. So, I don't know, someone's concealed something within that bin over there, the trash can, and I could tell you exactly what that actually is, that item in there. I'm just seeing that information at distance, so very much like remote viewing. And precognition, either seeing, dreaming of a specific thing before it happens, or just having an intuitive feeling about something before it happens. And these are incredibly common. I think the precognition phenomena is remarkable. I mean, to go back to things like 9/11, when you look at some of the statistics of how many people didn't die in 9/11, you can go to talks by people like Dr. Richard Broughton that was recorded for the Parapsychology Foundation. I think some of the figures were up to, I don't know if it was between 3,000 to 6,000 people didn't die who technically, as far as the statistics are concerned, should have done in 9/11, because on that morning, people that would regularly go to the Twin Towers, they would get distracted by something got in their way, they randomly decided to do something else. Some of these people were regular workers as well that really enjoyed their job there and were very rarely ever late, but on that particular morning, they just had a feeling that they should be doing something else, and so acted on it, or things got in their way. There's even studies back to the 1950s in the Journal of the American Society for Psychical Research by a researcher called Cox, who wanted to look at, on days of major train crashes, and fatalities happening, what's actually happening with the figures that commute on those days? And he found that there was a significant drop in people taking the train on those days when there were major fatalities, regardless of weather conditions as well. If it's a rainy day, you might expect that that person's going to naturally take a lift in a car with a friend anyway, but even on nice sunny days, there was still an unusual drop, suggesting somehow people may be intuitively acting on this inner feeling of danger and threat and do something else as well. Telepathy, though, that's very common. How about a raise of hands if you've ever had the experience of being in a large public setting like this, or a library, something like that, and you just feel a bit uncomfortable in that restaurant, and you turn around and out of a large group of people, there is someone staring in your direction that could have been staring at the back of your head. Hands up, how many people can relate to that? Quite a few, maybe about 50% there. How about you've been thinking of a friend or relative, one that you don't perhaps regularly talk to, they might live some distance away, and all of a sudden the telephone rings and you think that's them. Oh, even more for that, that's about 70%. So it shows how common these experiences are, and I also say, not a regular person that you expect calling every day, it's just someone that's been on your mind, and the two things seem to link together. So remarkably quite common. So what's actually going on there? Are we struggling to actually appraise coincidence? Have we had subtle cues that we're picking up on that has led to this event and it's made it seem like it's something unusual? Or is something else actually going on, something in terms of mind to mind? We see some good examples with that with twins, especially myozygotic twins, so perfectly identical twins. There's some great accounts of one being an airline pilot and the other one doing some manual labor job on the ground and breaking their arm. And the pilot suddenly has this excruciating pain in their arm and they can't get it away. It's only later on when they land, they discover that their twin has broken their arm and they're feeling that pain. So they've got this kind of beautiful link that you might also see with mother and child as well. Rupert Sheldrake talks about that in terms of milk letdown reflex. So if mother's away from child and she's breastfeeding, baby starts to cry, but she's some distance away, wouldn't possibly be able to actually hear the baby crying, but she'll start to lactate as well. So there've been some initial studies of looking at mother and child in separate labs and time syncing the baby crying to the mother actually lactating. So there's loads of studies going on looking into these biological and telepathic aspects. So PK, psychokinesis, also known as telekinesis. You're probably most familiar with this because of Uri Geller and the idea of spoon bending or manipulating metal. How many people here who think they've had an experience of telepathy? Could you raise my hand? Oh, you're doing it yourself. Oh, well done. There's your own mind over matter. You've raised your own hand using the power of your mind. Well done. So there's that, but it's not always metal. There's the idea that you could influence people or the environment via the power of the mind alone. Uri Geller's examples are really kind of tarnished by the media because many of the studies that have been done in parapsychology involve people not touching the items. They're in front of them, maybe in a sealed glass tube, and they're just asked to will it to bend or deflect, something like that, or try and spin a compass needle. And there's no touching of the items involved. A lot of the accounts of, say, poltergeist activity don't involve people touching the items. They're seeing something fly across the room. So the lab experiments try to replicate that and don't really want anyone touching or manipulating the items. Some of the very early studies of Uri Geller at Stanford Research Institute, they're quite compelling, even though they're very informal studies. He's touching nothing, and yet there's seemingly some really interesting outcomes developing there. But later on with all the media stuff, it's so dodgy. Was it the Jimmy Carlson show? Have I got that name? Johnny Carson. Okay, sorry. The interviewer, when he got Uri Geller on there, and I think James Randi had supplied all the objects for Uri to bend, and so nothing actually bent at all. And it's just such an embarrassing and excruciating interview to watch because Yuri's there for a good half an hour and does nothing except for saying, "I'm tired, I can't do it," and it's just painful. But anyway, there are some remarkable studies within parapsychology into psychokinesis. And then what I'm talking about today, survival. So this suggests any instance of perhaps the mind, consciousness, personality surviving outside of the body or even beyond bodily death. And so this is quite a big leap in terms of research because within consciousness studies itself, we don't fully understand how consciousness occurs. It's called the hard problem. We know the biological makeup of the brain, we know different regions of the brain and what they seemingly do, but a lot of it is uncharted and unmapped. Things like the hippocampus, long-term memory retrieval. It's just such a dark area of the brain. We really don't understand what's going on there. There's no limit to how much we can remember or for how long we can actually remember it for. It's way more powerful than any computer we actually have. And it's all made up of this biological substance and an electrical firing of neurons going on. So we've got so much more to learn. That's why research in any area of science, including parapsychology, has to keep going. But we're still making these leaps. People have experiences suggestive of survival, so we need to study them and, hand in hand with consciousness studies, understand what's going on. So I mentioned some universities. It's certainly within the United States, this has ebbed and flowed over time. At one point, you had this really good program going on at John F. Kennedy University that had a master's degree program in parapsychology for about 6 to 7 years. Some familiar names that you might know that were involved in that, they got the master's degree and then they also taught on it. People like Carlos Alvarado or Lloyd Auerbach. He was involved in that. Lloyd Auerbach's quite well known for ghost hunting and being on TV, talking about hauntings a lot here in the States. He gained his master's with John F. Kennedy. But in the UK, we certainly have all of these. University of Northampton is where I'm based, but the Coersley unit at the University of Edinburgh, that had Professor Bob Morris. He came from the United States and became our head professor there. He saw about 33 PhDs under his name, people that he trained up in parapsychology. They gained their PhDs and went off to other universities, setting up their own departments. Manchester Metropolitan University, I've had recent dealings with them. Goldsmiths, that's a bit different. We have Professor Chris French there, who purely kind of deals in anomalistic psychology. So that is, it's like parapsychology, but it's more or less saying, well, there are many different things that we already know of within psychology that produce the effect of a paranormal phenomena. And so there is nothing new to learn. We just need to understand what things that we already understand of psychology apply to instances that make something seem like you've seen a ghost or you've had a telepathic experience. So when I talked about appraising coincidence and other things, personality types, all those things, parapsychology takes it that step further. We're interested in all those aspects, but we're also open to the idea that we can learn something new and maybe there is this process of extrasensory perception going on. But how does that actually occur? And then all these other universities as well, they're just a handful. People will go there to do a module within a psychology degree of parapsychology. They might do their undergraduate dissertation in it, or they might even go on to do a research degree, such as an MPhil or a PhD. So we're really booming in the UK when it comes to parapsychology and its acceptance within educational curriculums as well. And that's changed a lot over time, especially within the last 10 years or so. Certainly since the last time I was here, I've seen way more acceptance and way more expansion on this. So let's go all the way back to after-death communication and what's really going on. So in the 1800s, certainly 1840, we had the rise of spiritualism. We had the Fox sisters in New York City, wide documentation of what they were experiencing, this banging and rapping about the house, the parents thinking that they were doing it in the bedroom. They'd run up to the room and find out, have they got out of bed? Are they banging on the floor? Are they knocking on the walls? Some skeptical assumptions were that they got an apple on a piece of string and they kept dropping it out on the bed on the floorboard and then pulling it back in and pretending they were asleep, all kinds of things. And there were initial experiments, or really loose experiments, where the father would stay in the house with the neighbour and they would ask this spirit to rap out letters and try and get information about what happened there. Allegedly, someone had died in the property beforehand and they were trying to communicate. But ultimately, this led to the Fox sisters going about presenting themselves as mediums, people that could be a channel for receiving information from the dead. And they were getting a lot of money for this and travelling quite wide and far to actually offer their services. Their older sister got involved as well. All kinds of scandals took place where they went to the papers eventually and said that they were actually making this up, it wasn't real. A year later, they retracted their statement as well. One of the sisters had become an alcoholic. Other claims had come forward that the only reason they were getting bangs and clicks in the seance room was because they'd learnt to click their toes inside their shoes, and that's what people were hearing. It's a really wide story, and there's some loads of really interesting articles and books on what actually happened with the Fox sisters and why they would make that statement that they were faking it and then retract it later. But it caused a lot of interest. Spiritualism boomed. Other people came forward saying that they had mediumistic abilities. People were reporting ghosts and hauntings more regularly in popular literature and newspaper articles, popular stories. And so scientists were eventually kind of jumping on this. In the 1860s, the Ghost Club was founded in London. People like Harry Price, who was a famous ghost hunter of the 1920s, 30s, he was a significant member of the Ghost Club. But the real kind of ignition of science in that was in the early 1880s at Cambridge University, Trinity College. It's made up of several different colleges, Trinity College being one of them. Several scholars got together, including people like Frederick Myers. I put them on opposite sides. I mean, that's Frederick Myers. If I'd have put them the other way around, it looked like they'd had an argument and they weren't looking at each other. it's that way around. And Edmund Gurney, they were some of the initial founders. Henry Sidgwick, who was a scholar of the history of medicine, he was involved. And in 1882, they founded the Society for Psychical Research, which is still going to this day. I'm a council member of that in London. 2 years later, in 1884, people like William James, eminent American psychologist, and several others, they founded the American Society for Psychical Research as well, which main aim was to more so debunk what the British Society was doing and these claims of hauntings and mediumship, because they really didn't think that much to them. But the more they started to investigate them, the more they realized that some of the claims didn't always have the explanations they expected. So they practically started working on the same lines as the British branch as well. But in their early proceedings, they published a really big book called, it's written down there, Phantasms of the Living. It's a massive 2-volume piece which outlines all kinds of experiences of ghosts and apparitions, even, especially, as it says there, apparitions of living people as well, and what's actually going on within those accounts. And they decided to take many of these accounts and then do separate studies from that they will publish in the proceedings. So in this particular paper on apparitions occurring soon after death, they took 231 cases of hallucinations of the dead, in which 28 occurred within 1 week of the death of that individual. Many accounts were revisited from that book, where 134 cases were of post-mortem apparitions, so apparitions of the dead. In some cases, it wasn't known whether at what point this experience had actually occurred, just because these were letter correspondence and people weren't interviewed, so there was missing information, but they seemed to fit the bill of being apparitions of the dead. And in 40 cases, these experiences occurred within a 24-hour period. That's known as a crisis period. So you might have in a 24-hour run-up of someone about to die, people having one of these experiences. At the point of death, so even perhaps the deathbed scenario, people have this rise of experiences, and then 24 hours afterwards as well. And it might occur very spontaneously. You might have a cousin that lives in Australia, for example, and you wake in the middle of the night, and you see your cousin at the end of the bed clutching their chest and then falling down, and you think, what was that all about? I was very much awake, I don't think I dreamt that. And the next day, you get a phone call from a relative in Australia saying your other relative had indeed died at that time of a heart attack, and it coincided with you waking up. So that's what we call a crisis apparition within that 24-hour period. And they go on for many years afterwards. So they wouldn't just occur within 24 hours. People can still have after-death communications many, many years afterwards. So they did this very basic diagram to just show you that idea. So in a week leading up, especially if you've got people that are on the deathbed, there's a brilliant book on that by Sir William Barrett from 1926 called Deathbed Apparitions, or Deathbed Visions, sorry. This week leading up, at the point of death, especially in care homes or hospitals where people are undergoing end-of-life care, you get a lot of physicians and nurses reporting this kind of peak of people dying and then feeling a rush of something leaving the body or leaving the room, or some people even reporting a mist coming out of that person's head. In a really nice way, as a tradition in some care homes where that's happening, or hospitals, they leave the window open with this idea that if something is leaving the body, it can go out the window and go back into the world and disseminate, rather than being trapped in the building. And then after a year, people still report these experiences, but they start to steadily decline and people are reporting them less and less. It doesn't mean to say that the incidence of them has necessarily gone down, but if you're living around these experiences, they might just become neutralized, and you're not really recognizing them as much because that period of bereavement has passed, and you looking out for these experiences might actually start to calm down as well. But they were very, very common. And so I had a colleague as well. I mean, you had Dr. William Derry Rees, Derry being the Welsh equivalent of David, who was from North Wales. He passed away earlier last year, and I was that close to going to meet him. It was one of those things where he didn't live that far away from me, maybe an hour and a half drive, and we constantly said about getting together and chatting, and he hated email, so we're forever writing letters to each other and sticking them in the post, and I kept a whole book of everything we were talking about. But I just missed him. I ended up writing his obituary and went to, the closest I got to meeting him was going to his funeral, so I just missed the bill. But he was a really, really nice chap. And he was the person that everything that I've just mentioned the SPR were doing, that's just one or two studies. They did many of those studies talking about post-death apparitions and how common they were. But because it's under this domain of psychical research, parapsychology, wider scientists weren't really reading these kinds of articles or research papers because they were in parapsychology-themed journals, and no one was really giving it that recognition. What Derry was doing, he'd done most of his research on thanatology, looking at dying, death and bereavement, mainly looking at fatality incidences in rural tractor accidents. Those were his main papers. and all kinds of road collisions that were happening in the countryside. But then he was practicing as a GP. He'd spent time working in Canada as a GP as well. And then later on, he really wanted to just carry on with research. It was very unusual for a general practice doctor to actually want to be an active researcher as well. And he realized that to gain any recognition from psychiatrists, psychologists, parapsychologists involved in research, he needed a research degree. He needed to be seen as actually active. So he went to King's College London and started to do an MD. You didn't need a medical doctorate to have the title of doctor when you were in general practice. It just came with it. But he went to do an MD, purely a research thesis in that area, and he was looking at just purely what are the negative consequences of bereavement. Sleepless nights, not wanting to socialize, loss of appetite, oversensitiveness to noise, many, many things when you've really suffered separation anxiety, you've lost someone really close, and you're trying to readjust and figure out what is life going to be like moving forward, my general routine without this person in my routine. And by the time he got to the end of that, the last few participants that he was interviewing, a few of them said, well, after they'd gone, I felt their presence around me. And he went, how do you mean? He said, well, I'd be in a room and felt like they were around me, but when I looked around, there was no one there, but I had just this strong feeling of their presence being in the room. And he'd interviewed so many people, I think it was about 293. He went back to his entire participant pool and started to interview them again. As an interview-based study, that's a lot of participants to interview, rather than just getting them to fill in a survey. And he went back and asked them, had you ever had one of these experiences of sensing the presence of the dead? And many people said, well, yeah, I think I did. Around 50% in total did. And they range from just purely sensing the presence of that person through to smelling them, perfumes, tobaccos, things like that, aftershave associated with them, hearing them, feeling their touch, sounds going up and down the stairs, hearing them call out now and then, maybe seeing them sit on the bed or an indentation of them sitting on the bed, through to seeing their apparition as well, so believing that they'd actually walked about the house and they'd seen them, or even dreaming about them as well. So some very significant dreams that people would say, I dreamt about them, but it wasn't the same as a regular dream I might have. It seemed more real. They were very conscious of the fact that they were dead and that we were meeting in the dream and they were giving me some advice or words of comfort. So all of those kinds of experiences were included. He also asked them, though, how did you actually feel about these experiences? And the vast majority of people said that they found them very helpful to actually have them during a time of bereavement. It might have been the first loss that they'd ever had. It might have been the first time they'd ever had one of these types of experiences. But I suppose in comparison to their other instances of bereavement, having one of these experiences associated with that deceased person, very helpful. Some people weren't sure in the neutral category. But then for some people, they found it harmful. So initially, more so scary. Just because it took them by surprise, seeing someone that they know to be dead suddenly standing in the corner of the room or feeling their presence. Or in some more traumatic cases, if they died in a car accident or something else where there was damage to their body, they see them in that state, visualized as the apparition. It would rarely happen, but we have some instances of that, so that's why they could say it was perhaps scary. But in a lot of cases, people might report an apparition of the dead to look 10 years younger or so than they actually did at the point that they died, where, say, they'd slowly died through something like cancer and their muscle capacity had started to waste away and they looked very poorly. They wouldn't generally be seen like that as an apparition. In some instances, people have seen apparitions of the dead looking younger than at the point you ever knew the person. So before you ever met them, but you can still see it's definitely them, but they look so much more younger and youthful. So they look healthy and vibrant, and that also makes the person having the experience feel good as well. So Derry, when he'd done this was his medical doctorate. In that same year of 1971, he summarized this thesis and published it in the British Medical Journal. And it was that gained recognition. That was a massive stepping point for parapsychology. Even though he wasn't really involved in parapsychology, this was his link. He was referencing stuff from psychical research, he was acknowledging parapsychology, he was engaging with parapsychologists, and this went in a medical journal. So that was fantastic. Medical practitioners were becoming aware of it, other counselors and people dealing with the bereaved could recognize it as well. I think around 1950, we saw a turning point where any textbook on bereavement or death, dying and bereavement was starting to actually at least give some mention to the fact that when people suffer a personal loss, they may experience the presence of the dead. And there's loads of conventional explanations we could turn to, especially given the fact that you may just return to a house where you both lived in it. All their things are there, typical smells and things like that are there, but some experiences might seem to go beyond that as well. And I'll mention a little bit about those and what I mean by that. So this is Julian Burton, Dr. Julian Burton. Does anyone recognize him? Anyone that's a fan of films? He was an actor. His most famous film, most of his films I think were just purely US-based. His most famous film was called A Bucket of Blood. No? It's weird. I've asked some people in the UK and everyone, yeah, I've seen that film. I'm like, I've never heard of it. And you've watched it. He was an actor for many, many years. His undergraduate degree was in theatre studies. And I just found him an unusual character to crop up in this. When I was doing my research on this, I wasn't really so much reading books on after-death communication, like Hello from Heaven by Guggenheim and many others by Lois Legrand and people like that. I was reading other doctoral theses to actually look at, well, where do I go next? What have other doctoral theses done on after-death communications and what are they missing? And I found that in Fate magazine, some of you might remember that, I've got a whole collection of Fate magazine. I find it a really kind of fun source to actually turn to. He'd published a summary article of his doctoral thesis that he completed in 1980 through International College. So I think it was one of the USA's many kind of variations of what we have, the Open University, that was largely correspondence learning, and you'd meet up now and then with your tutors, especially if you're doing a PhD, to discuss the progress of your studies. He was only doing a doctoral thesis because of an experience that he'd had about ADCs, and he wanted to learn more. So, the summary is in the April 1982 edition. What he did was he handed out surveys and he had 206 participants in total, and he just wanted to learn a bit more about how do these experiences affect people and how common are they. One of his main comments that came out of it that I think that's really important, even though we had that paper 9 years beforehand by Rees, was that I'm afraid a bias still exists which considers it unacceptable to deal at face value with experiences such as seeing ghosts. The patient is trained to deny these experiences or to explain it away as holding on to the loved one. And so we found that a lot of medical doctors, more so your general practitioner, if you went to them saying that your own bereavement, your own grief is actually quite traumatizing, you're struggling to cope with it, and you're having these experiences, these were some of the typical comments or feedback people were giving, saying, oh, the doctor just told me to ignore it, I'm hanging on to them too much, I need to let go. Now, it might be quite comforting. They're not actually asking about that. They're not asking about your family or your friends visiting your house and whether they've had experiences as well. They might just go beyond this pure separation anxiety feeling that you might actually have. And separation anxiety applies to many things. You talk about bereavement, and it's not just for the loss of a person. It can be amputation, that you go to the hospital or you wake up in the hospital because of an accident and ultimately you've lost a hand, a whole arm, a leg. If that happens, you've got to then discover and reevaluate life moving forward without that limb. It's important to you. You've always had it. And to suddenly not have it, what's actually going to be the way forward after that? Childbirth as well. You spent 9 months with a new body actually growing inside you and discovering it step by step. From the moment you discover you're pregnant to the first movements inside of the baby that you might feel, the first initial bubbles, through to the first scan and actually seeing that it's real, and then physiological changes taking place, and then through to full kicks. There's a whole change within that 9-month cycle, and then separation, which is why we want to try and avoid postnatal depression as well. We want that transition to become a new attachment again. We've gone from one attachment and we don't want to lose it. We want it to then be skin to skin, baby's close, baby's real now. It's another person, it's separate, but it's with me all the time. If we get postnatal depression, it might become a form of separation anxiety. Essentially, you get the same symptoms. Weddings, divorces, people cry at weddings because their son, their daughter is, even though they might be living with that partner for a long time, it just marks a new point in life. You getting older, they're getting older, they're actually doing something official, a landmark in time, and it's teary because it's actually saying this is a change, this is a new part of life. Or when you split up with a partner, and you might both need to do that because it's for the best, you might have grown apart or any other things, but you then still have to acknowledge that how does life work the way forward without that person in my routine as well. So you'll still have those separation type anxiety feelings, even though you need to do it. So bereavement is many things, it's not just through the loss of a person. So he acknowledged this, he acknowledged they were common, he acknowledged what Rees was doing and what the SPR had done. Why did he get involved in this? What had happened? Well, he'd had an experience himself, and that's what spurred him on to actually go back to this. So he said, I had always felt a strong bond between us. This is the loss of his mother. But by September, most of us in the family had returned to our routines, reconciled to her death. One evening that September, my wife and I were entertaining relatives. I was in the kitchen cutting a pineapple when I heard what I thought were my wife's footsteps behind me to the right. I turned to ask the whereabouts of a bowl, but realized that she had crossed to the left outside of my field of vision. I turned in that direction to repeat my question and saw my mother standing there. Burton described his mother's apparition as looking 10 years younger than she was when she'd actually died and in good health, and she was wearing a detailed pale blue gown, which he'd never seen before. He continued, "Ma," I exclaimed. She smiled and then she dissolved. She didn't disappear, she dissolved. I let out a great sigh of relief and felt as if a heavy weight had been lifted from me, a weight I had not even felt until that time. The pale blue gown is really significant because this is what adds an extra element to these experiences that parapsychology is certainly interested in when we talk about survival evidence and what goes beyond just pure separation anxiety and those symptoms we might recognize. I think it was the next day he called his sister and explained about this experience that he'd had, and she was distraught by what he was saying. She was really tearful and quite angry, and you can imagine why. She was more or less initially saying, "Why you? I was closer to Mother than you were. Why did she come to you and have such an experience? She was there in your kitchen with you and not me. I haven't had one of these experiences." He went on to describe this in more detail in the pale blue gown, and that was it for her. She said, "Oh, I get it. That's for me. That's my message. That's why she was doing it, because you don't know anything about that." And he said, "What?" And he said, "Well, about 6 weeks or so before she did pass away, I guess suddenly they'd gone shopping. And they were trying on different clothes, and one thing that her mother seemed to really like was this detailed pale blue gown that she tried on, described in the exact detail, but it was some $400 or $500, and she wasn't willing to separate that amount of money for the gown. She couldn't justify it. But she was in the shop for ages, I think, debating whether she should or shouldn't. If you really like it, treat yourself, get it, but she didn't. But it made sense to her. And so for her, that was her after-death communication. You shouldn't have known about that information, you don't know about that information, but I do, and yet it was incorporated into your apparitional experience for me. So we'd call that veridical information, where you've had an experience suggestive of communicating with the dead, but there's additional information involved that you shouldn't know about, but in following it up, it makes sense to someone, or you can actually piece the whole jigsaw together. One of the most famous cases of this in the SPR, I think it's a great one, and loads of people have gone down the line of criticising it and looking for conventional explanations, and there are many, but some people might say it's been debunked. As far as I'm concerned, as an SPR council member, and seeing all the evidence laid out, the fors and the against, it's still a case with a big question mark over it. It's called the Chaffin and Chaffin-Will case, and essentially, it was in the late 1800s, I think it was, and there was a guy called Chaffin, and he'd got 5 sons, and when he died, he'd organised in his the will that was read out that one of his sons, I think it was the second youngest, he was actually quite ill. So Chaffin had assumed that this particular son of the 5 had not actually got much longer to live, so he more or less gave most of his estate to his son. It wasn't distributed out to all of them. That son didn't die. I think he lived on a lot longer than expected, but it was some 3-4 years later, one of the older sons had a dream that his father came to him and said, actually, I did write that will, but I wrote a second one, and it's not been discovered. What you need to do is go to my grandfather's old bomber jacket and look inside the lining. You'll find something else. And so the son woke up. He contacts one of his brothers, asks about it, says, I think mother knows, and the mother was asked about this old bomber jacket, and she said, yeah, you need to call one of your other sons. I gave it to him after your father died. Travels 30 miles to go and find this jacket, and he says, oh, it's in the attic. They go up there, they find it, it's got a bee's nest in it. It's been up there for so long, so they get that away, and they open it up inside and have a look, and sure enough, there is something sewn into the lining on the inside. They unstitch it and find not a will, but a note that says, go to my grandfather's old Bible and look in Genesis. And so they go back to the mother. Where's I guess this will be great-grandfather's old Bible. We need that now. And she said, well, it's over here on the shelf. It's not been touched ages. They open it up, and lo and behold, there is a second will in there that outlines a distribution of the estate equally to all 5 sons, signed again by Chaffin. So one of the later criticisms was that the handwriting has changed. It still is a similar signature, but it's gone the opposite way. Handwriting experts say that this is the handwriting of a younger person, not of an older person. It's not gone the right direction. It's the opposite. So there's all that and questioning, had one of the sons done it? but then again, they distributed it equally. No one was trying to get a share for themselves. So loads of questions. It's so old now, there's no way you could truly figure out what actually happened there. But in terms of following up information after an experience, it's a big one. Myself and Dr. David Saunders, he's a dream expert, really, lucid dreaming, but he's involved heavily with parapsychology and teaches on it at Northampton with me. We mainly looked at these dream scenarios and people having a message from the dead and saying, go and look at this and you'll find a load of money. And they have done, like bundles of, $50 bills and things like that. And I was like, those are really interesting cases, the fact that they've acted on a dream and found this stuff out. No one just randomly wakes up and finds money like that, but some of these cases have come forward. So that's why Burton got involved, and then many studies occurred after that. I think I read about 15 doctoral theses that followed this up. They each got less. Those were the biggest studies that occurred of some, few hundred people. And then after that, there were very small theses where people had gone and interviewed 12 people or so that had had these experiences and gone in as much detail as they could to find out, how do people feel following these experiences? How do they live with them? So I wanted to take it forward. I mean, if you've read Guggenheim and Eddie DeVers and many of these books that you get on life after death communications, there might be some chapters or people mentioning that these experiences give people hope. But it's ended there. No one's ever really explained what hope means, how it's defined as a cognitive mechanism, as a mechanism of your mind or as an emotion. How does it actually work? How do we use it to our benefit? What is hope? And it's really old as well. You can take it back to Greek mythology, and hopefully some of my students, it's really sad, they don't know Pandora. But you know Pandora and Pandora's box? Thank goodness. So I tell the whole story of that, and I think it's beautiful, where she was gifted by the gods beauty, intelligence, and wisdom, and they gave her one thing that they just told her that she should look after, and that was the box. And she was told under no circumstances should she ever open the box. And she's roaming the world and has the box, and as she's human, curiosity just gets the better of her. Curiosity killed the cat, but satisfaction brought it back. And when she opens the box, though, she discovers that all the terrors of the world are unleashed: famine, tyranny, diseases, war, everything comes out, and it frightens her, and she slams the lid of the box shut, realizing what she's done, defying the gods, and holds it close to her breast, and realizes that she hasn't let everything outside of the box. Something is still trapped inside the box, hidden within its deep recesses, and what was inside the box, the only thing that remained was hope. And so in times of despair and absolute desperation, there is still hope that we can actually triumph. If we've got to such a situation that it's so bad, we always say that from this point on it can only get better. And if you're coping with it as well. So maybe we can relate that to bereavement as well. You've got to a point where things are so negative, there must be something that you can latch onto to get yourself out of that situation. If you're not having an after-death communication, if you've never had one during a time of bereavement, you found other things. You had friends, you had family that would take you out shopping, would encourage you to go out and go for a walk with them, or they'd bring you things, or you turn to grief work yourself. When my grandmother, all my grandparents are long since passed on, but when my grandmother lost my grandfather, I remember she loved baking, she just turned to baking. She made cakes, she made trifles, she made more than we could possibly eat because it kept her busy and it kept her mind active as well. You'd turn to your own grief work. And she'd be looking ahead to what am I going to bake tomorrow? And there's a small element of hope. What is tomorrow going to bring me? What should I do next? Moving forward, thinking ahead, that's what hope is, it's goal attainment. And so I wanted to look at that in terms of psychology. But I wanted to compare groups. So I had 100 participants, and I split them into two groups, and I have 50 people that had suffered a significant bereavement but claimed they'd never had an after-death communication, and another 50 that said that they did. And they'd had everything from the sense of presence experience through to poltergeist activity, movements of objects about the house, seeing apparitions and dreaming of them. But all spontaneous, so no instances of visiting mediums where you've actually sought out this communication. You need a communication, so you've gone to someone that claims that they can do this. I wanted all the natural experiences. You're going about your daily business, and it just happens, and you've associated it as communication with the dead. So they're all initially asked to fill out a questionnaire battery. I was asking them about their levels of paranormal belief, about their afterlife belief, religiosity as well. And then I was asking them about hope. And the hope scale was really interesting. It was one that is given out in times of trauma and disaster, and I'd reword it to talk about bereavement and times of loss, just the opening lines. And then all the questions were about, when you're in times of despair or trouble, do you turn to religious scripture to help you? Do you consider yourself a very sporty and active person and quite competitive? Those kinds of things. How much are you determined you turn to things, you try and latch on to things to help you, grapple forward and claw forward in life? And so for the control group, and an additional end section was added where they were free to write about their experiences as well. And so the group that didn't have the experiences, they didn't have anything else to write about because they hadn't had an experience. But the people that did, I wanted to know, freely talk about it. Just write as much as you can about what this experience actually was. And to summarize this, I don't want to bombard you with too much writing, so try and ignore what I'm putting on here. I'll try and explain it as far as I can. This was really interesting for me, and we still need to fully write this up. We've written it in various ways and we've presented it, but these were the summaries of my 2 scales of hope. So this is the group that had experiences, and this is the group that didn't. This is the amount of hope that was being kind of produced in the questionnaire by people that had experiences, but before they'd suffered a loss. So they were asked to fill it in. Remember a time before you'd actually lost that person, how you felt, and how would you answer these questions then? And then after they'd suffered the loss and had the experience, fill in the questionnaire again. How did you feel immediately after those instances of loss and experience? So for those people that did, they were higher hopers anyway than people that didn't have these experiences. But there was a drop in hope, but not very much. In terms of statistics, this wasn't a significant drop at all. But in terms of statistics for this, it was a big drop. So for people that didn't have experiences, they had a significant loss of hope and ability to move forward and obtain goals. They had to turn to other things. For people that did have these experiences, anything from dreaming, sensing the presence, just a smidge of a movement. It looks bigger on here, but as far as the stats are concerned, it's going down, but it's not a massive kind of loss. These experiences had filled the gap of loss. They were soothing, they were comforting, they were natural. They helped people move on extremely quickly because they'd incorporated that person into their life as a continued bond. Yeah, I'm still in a relationship with that person, friend or close partner, whatever. They're around me in another way now. They're physically not here, but this experience is suggesting something more. And that's what I was taking hope to be. What do we actually mean about hope in this context? Well, it's a win-neutral situation, I think. You haven't got a lose element to it. These experiences are suggesting that for the person, regardless of me following it up as a parapsychologist and looking for what's the actual measurable evidence you've had an experience, I'm not concerned about that. You say you've had the experience, I'll take that as read. What's it done to you? I'm interested in the health aspect of it, the clinical parapsychology side. And so you've had this experience and it suggests the person's still around. And so what's that ultimately going to do? Well, when you come to the end of your own life, you're going to die and perhaps become reunited with this person, as suggested by the experience, or you'll be dead and nothing. You won't know about it at all, extinguished, gone. If that's the case, you haven't lost out because you won't know. You won't know that you've lost out of anything. So it's a win-neutral situation. So there is no harm in people embracing these experiences. You might get some popular TV critics and people that talk about parapsychology phenomena and saying that, it's so damaging that these experiences, people taking it to be life after death or going to see mediums, it's so wrong that mediums either do this freely or even take money for it as a living because it's deceiving people. Well, you could say the same of a counselling psychologist that's dealing with the bereaved as well. They're sitting talking about their experiences and stuff. A medium may act as an alternative form of bereavement counselling. Some people don't want to be stigmatised as going to see a therapist or a counselling psychologist, especially after bereavement. People want to be seen as being able to cope with their own things in life, especially bereavement. So mediumship is popularly put out there as a form of entertainment. People will go as whole groups of people to see a medium. And so if people get an individual message and they take it on board and it's comforting, then where's the harm in that? We've done studies on mediums and looked at the benefits, and they are great. I've never seen an individual study that has actually demonstrated what these popular critics on TV would say that are not involved in parapsychology or these particular sciences that say it's damaging. I've seen no evidence for that. I can't present you with any peer-reviewed paper that would suggest that. True, some people have bad experiences with mediums where they didn't get along with that person, that the personalities clashed, or they feel they didn't get a very good reading. But they might just go to another medium after that. They don't seem to report or have it on record that they've had a bad experience and how that impacted on them. Generally, it's very good. And these spontaneous experiences are very good. Those negative experiences are really, really minor. So this is the overall hope that was actually coming out of those people. Generally, we've got some people that consider themselves after this bereavement and after this experience quite hopeful, the really top level, 28% of them. But our majority, 60%, moderately hopeful. That's way higher than the people that didn't have these experiences at all. And some people had low levels of hope, but no one at all considered themselves on this scale, following loss, following these experiences as being completely hopeless. They had things to latch onto, they had things to live for, the experience helped them move forward. And these are some of the popular experiences that occurred. So sense of presence experience was extremely high. It was really weird how it worked out. 25 of my participants had had just one experience. The other 25 participants had had multiple experiences as well. And that's why we've got different numbers going on here that don't add up to 50. This is how many reports actually occurred overall. Voices and sounds, apparitions, dreams, movements of objects as well, they were all quite high. And then after that, we get a drop. So symbolic experiences. We had some people that they might be going out for coffee with a friend soon after their loss, and they see a butterfly land on their hand. And the other person might see it might be a genuine butterfly, but in some other instances, only they could see the butterfly, and it meant something to them. Or what else? White feathers. Some people have seen those about the house after losing someone, just a white feather fluttering down, or finding pennies as well about the house where they, maybe they don't even carry change around that much, but they kept on finding pennies everywhere, and they associate it as them, or things just related to the deceased as well. Smells, being touched, anomalous lights as well suddenly occurring, synchronistic events, again, things tying up that related to the deceased, some temperature changes, one instance of a premonition of death as well. That was a really interesting case, and we're writing it up as a case study at the moment. My participant, she's based here in the States, she's a yoga practitioner, and she's also claimed that for many years she's a medium, and she's also done that as part of her living as well. She's gone out and given demonstrations. And she was sleeping one night and just heard this large bang, thought it was gunfire. She'd grown up around guns and the family having guns, and it sounded very much like gunfire, and she dashed to the window and looked out thinking someone had let off a gun outside in the yard. She couldn't see anyone. She went downstairs and realized that the closet door had burst open and everything, all the shelves had collapsed, everything had fallen out. And she thought, well, that maybe that's what I've assumed in my half-sleepy state is the gunfire. Packed it away. Her mother was still alive, I think, but she got on the most with her aunt and considered her more of the alternative mother figure because she didn't get on as well with her mother. This aunt was as close as a mother. And she discovered the next day through messages that were given to her, actual messages through the telephone or some other form of correspondence, she was told that her aunt had passed away that night. She'd taken her own life in New York. She'd gone to the bathroom and shot herself. Same time she'd heard this gunfire. Now, she got really upset because she'd spent so much time practicing as a medium that she didn't have any message from her aunt. She had no kind of warning mediumistically coming up. Following that, she didn't have any experiences with her. And so she backed away from mediumship. She stopped practicing. She said, I think I am a fraud. Why am I getting all these messages, but I don't get them from family? I'm certainly not getting any experiences. I think I'm just making this up. And sometimes it seems to be right, sometimes it isn't. And so she carried on and focused more on the yogi practitioner stuff in gyms and things like that. But I think it was a year later she was doing that, and everyone was out on their mats doing their thing, and she's at the front leading. And everyone gets into quite a meditative state. And she said she had this very transpersonal experience where she saw the apparition of her aunt in front of her, delivering messages about why she took her own life and other things like that, and apologies. And she just felt that it was one of the best yogi sessions she'd actually had, and just felt elation and brilliant because she'd had one of these ADCs, this after-death communication. But what she also found weird was, as everyone was rolling up the mats and they were getting ready, everyone was talking amongst themselves about the session and saying, did you feel something else in the room? It was a really powerful session. It felt like something else was in here. For her, that was really weird. She'd never had people kind of discussing that afterwards, saying that they felt an additional presence in the room. And to say she'd had such a powerful experience, she thought that tied in really well. She went back to mediumship. She'd also changed her relationships, felt more positive after that. So many positive benefits came with this after a period of self-doubt and this initial premonition as well of a death. So we need to write that up. This shows that the research is ongoing. This is all just closed down. I had it on Facebook. I think Liz may have noticed this as well. I was pushing this for ages. We had an English questionnaire, a French questionnaire, and a Spanish questionnaire, all asking the same things. It was a really long online questionnaire. It took about 40 minutes to complete. But we wanted to upgrade what Derry Rees had done, that 293 participants. And we've had this going since last year. I think it was open for 6 months or so. It's literally only just closed, but we want to do a new, larger analysis of what are the various types of experiences that people have. This is going to be at least a dozen papers to go off to different medical journals and things like that. We want to get another one in the British Medical Journal. I'm happy to say that as of last week, when we finally had the Spanish one close, we've collected 1,005 questionnaires of after-death communication in these 3 various languages, that the amount of information in there, especially written accounts of these experiences, are just immense. It is going to take so long to deal with this data, not only the questionnaire, but the written stuff as well. So that's the biggest project we've got going on. It's the biggest one to date, so I'm so pleased to be involved with that. So last time I was here, I spoke about telephone calls from the dead and people's experiences of it. And it was a side project. Aside from my PhDs and stuff like that and other studies, I was independently looking at this. As an undergraduate student, I'd found the book Phone Calls from the Dead by D. Scott Rogo and Raymond Bayliss, and I'd also seen that on MSN News, here in California, there'd been a massive train collision that had been in the news around 2008, and a guy called Charles Peck was on one of the commuter trains heading home. And everyone realized there'd been this crash, and his family discovered that it was on the news and he was involved in one of those trains, and they were getting numerous calls on their phone saying that he was calling. And when they picked up, they just heard static, so they assumed that he was caught in the wreckage and perhaps reaching out for his mobile phone and just tapping it, and his wife and son and daughter were getting these repeated calls, and it would only be static. And they're watching the live news feed as well. And so they're yelling words of encouragement down the phone saying, "Don't worry, Dad, help's coming, the rescuers will be there shortly," thinking he's really trying to get to the phone. And when they tried to call him back, the phone would either go to voicemail or act as though the battery had died as well, so you weren't getting anything at all. So they repeatedly had this until 3:30 a.m. That's at the point that they found his body. He'd died on first impact. The phone was never recovered. What I found interesting, as a budding psychologist at the time, was the fact that the media had widely portrayed this as a phone call from the dead, when of course there are many conventional explanations, one being that it's only calling the last people in his call register, close family, and the phone has been smashed and it's damaged, and it would just keep, if it's jammed against something, it's just doing that repeatedly until the battery dies. No one's talking to anyone. There is no communication going on. There's nothing apart from the suggestion that it's his phone. But I was interested in that and the fact that there had been a book in 1979 called Phone Calls from the Dead, but they're outlining full-on conversations with people. So what's gone on there? We've got the landline technology, and before that, wireless telegraph. Now we've got iPhones and we've got text messages and emails. So what's actually happened in that turnaround? So by 2008, 2009, I started to tentatively look into this and collect more accounts and more modern day accounts. But some of the history goes back to David Wilson. This was an article that was published in Light, which is the journal of the College of Psychic Studies. It's in London, right across the road from the Natural History Museum. It's also the place where Harry Price, the ghost hunter of the 1920s and 30s, had his lab on the top floor and tested the medium Eileen Garrett before she emigrated to America and set up the Parapsychology Foundation in 1951. And David Wilson was I think he was a lawyer, a solicitor in London, and he was interested in this whole idea of electronic communication with the dead, and he'd taken a wireless telegraph machine and adapted it so it didn't have the receiving wire, so he shouldn't be getting any communication in, and still it was producing taps coming out in Morse code. I think it also replaced it so it had a galvanometer, so it was doing beep, 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 actual beeps that were more clear to hear, and you get other people involved as well that would try and translate the Morse code to make sure that he wasn't just getting it wrong, and they were getting a similar message as well. They assumed that maybe in the next apartment there were other people that had a similar device, and maybe still it was receiving something, but they get strange messages such as wait 5 days and 6 hours, and they wait 5 days and 6 hours and nothing would happen. But they kept on getting messages like this. He assumed, though, that this wasn't from the dead. He believed it was from extraterrestrials that were trying to deliver messages. But still, it was an early account of these devices. Francis Grierson, he was based in Nottingham, where I'm from. He had an early device he talked about in Light, where he developed this machine that had a test tube in it, where if he collected ectoplasm, this substance produced from mediums that allegedly forms apparitions, is frequently depicted in popular media as a slimy substance. And in some debunked medium instances, when they had a stooge hidden behind the curtains in the dark, they would have buckets of some sort of slime, hopefully wallpaper paste or something like that, nothing too disturbing, being thrown at people. But some of the more unusual accounts of ectoplasm, it's actually more like a smoke or ashy substance when it's left behind. So if you've ever burnt a piece of paper and it's burnt perfectly and it looks fine and you touch it and just disintegrates, it's more or less reported like that in some of the early accounts. But after he had this one with a test tube in it, and he has these photographs that do just look like cigarette smoke, he was working on a new device. And there's a backstory to that. His eldest son, was a radio and telephone engineer in the war at the time. And he'd suffered an injury and then was assigned to teaching other military personnel how to mend radios and telephones. And so he was living locally, and he'd go to this electrical shop locally to pick up extra bits of equipment for his students and other things like that. And he fell in love with a lady that worked there, and the family hoped that they'd be married one day. They were engaged, and a short illness took her, and she died, and he was absolutely distraught that he'd lost her. This was over some period of time. But Grierson and his youngest son and wife and a friend that they got staying for Easter, Grierson had got this long interest in spiritualism and psychical research, and this Easter they were holding a séance, I think late afternoon, and the eldest son returns home and sees that they're holding a séance, and he just poo-poos the whole thing, and the youngest son says, "Shh, we're getting a message from Jay." There's Jay something else, we just get the initials in the initial report. And that perks up his interest, and he comes in and listens, and they were getting specific Morse code type taps coming out on the table. Now, this is way before the days of text messages, and he and his lady friend at the electrical shop frequently spoke on wireless telegraph. And so they knew that it was each other initiating a conversation. They would have a specific starting code that would have to say, "It's me, and I've got some messages for you." And that specific code came through. And so he listened, and he was rapping taps back. And he was very much convinced, beyond his skepticism that he had for ages, that this is unusual. You know, very specific messages are coming through that me and my deceased fiancé had. So what's going on? Well, Grierson wanted to get his son involved in developing this new machine. You've got this knowledge of telephones and wireless devices. I want you to help me build a device. Clearly, you being in the séance increased the activity that we had in the communication. And I know you're so busy teaching at these colleges, but I want the machine to have some sort of element of you that that can come with me, so it's portable and will increase my chances of having communications come through. I'll talk about that a bit further and what actually happened, if I've included that slide next. I hope it's still there. I mixed that up, sorry, Melton. I mentioned Grierson so much. Everything I've just said, attribute it to Melton. Melton was the person in Nottingham. Francis Grierson was based here in California, had written novels and things like that, and practiced in Europe as a medium under the name of Jesse Shepherd. And one of the final books that Francis Grierson produced is called Psychophone Messages. It's been reprinted in terms of photocopied and placed on Amazon now, and it was an old psychophone, a thing that you would leave by your bed, that when you played these wax cylinders down the old recording device, it would play you inspirational speech as you slept. If you wanted to learn how to be better in business, it would play you speech about that. If you wanted to learn about how to have better relationships, you go to sleep in this idea that the unconscious mind is taking in this kind of positive inspirational speech. They put the psychophone device in the séance, had it on reverse where you have a blank cylinder and it can record like a dictaphone, and they were getting all kinds of messages. And the transcripts in this book are really long. There are messages from Abraham Lincoln, General U.S. Grant, and people like that. 4 or 5 pages of speech about things that are going to come, even predicting things like World War II and then even World War III. It hasn't happened yet. Hopefully it isn't going to happen. But things like that. It's a bizarre book because it really doesn't explain anything about the device or what was going on. But that was Grierson. Melton was the guy in Nottingham, had this device, got his son involved. We'll talk a little bit more about that. This is my ultimate initial link to Liz, Raymond Bayliss. Raymond Bayliss is argued to be the very first person in parapsychology to have published an official scientific report on allegedly recording anomalous sounds, raps and taps, and placing it in a parapsychology journal. He'd been doing these studies since the early 50s with a medium and a gentleman who claimed he could project his consciousness and people could see it elsewhere, a guy called Attila Vonzele. And they had a studio set up here that was soundproof, and they'd do all these recordings where sometimes Vonzele would go in a cabinet, other times he'd be out, they'd sit there in silence, they'd just have this reel-to-reel machine recording. And on playback, they would get strange scratching noises, whispers, bangs, and taps. And so Raymond Bayliss published in the correspondence of the Journal of the American Society for Psychical Research in 1959, and no one cared. No one replied to it, no one gave a follow-up article. He seemed, in some of his later writing, quite annoyed at how much his stuff went unnoticed. Unfortunately, we had a few years, well, even within that same year, Frederick Jurgensen had many contacts in the media. He was a filmmaker and he was recording bird songs. And there's a few kind of twisted stories as to what came first, but allegedly his mother's voice was heard within these recordings of bird songs that he was making, and he believed that he'd discovered this phenomenon of EVP. Yet Raymond had been doing it many years before this, and we had this accidental discovery by Frederick Jurgensen. And so that went in the media, not much of it published in English though. The later person that became famous for this was Dr. Konstantin Raudover, who published the book Breakthrough regarding these communications, which also came with an LP. So as you read the book, you could listen to some of these recordings yourself and actually check out what he was saying and how it was interpreted. Later on, we had David Ellis as well. He gained the Perrott Warwick Scholarship for students and had 2 years of funding at Trinity College to look into this phenomena and find out what was going on. How were these bangs and raps occurring? Were they truly anomalous? Are people really getting voices of the dead, even though they're very kind of simplistic, some of them? And he believed that a lot of it was down to group suggestion and pareidolia. So pareidolia being when you have random shapes in the environment or even sounds, your brain will fill in the gaps. If you're in the dark wondering about a building that you're not familiar with, you will look for heads, body shapes, things like that, other humans that you can relate to, which is why we get so nervous that we're going to see another person, but more so a silhouette that we can't recognize. You get the same with clouds. You look up at the clouds, you see a beautiful bunny rabbit. Oh, look, that cloud looks like a bunny rabbit. It might do. It might very well look like a bunny rabbit, but ultimately, it's a cloud. But our brain is hot-wired to actually do that. So David Ellis was very convinced that that was going on. One of the latest researchers for this is Anne Winsper. She's conducting her PhD at the University of Central Lancashire, and it's on the psychology of electronic voice phenomena as well. So she's down similar lines as David Ellis, but Raymond Bayliss continued regardless. Up until, I think, the late 1970s, I'm still finding reports where he continued doing different experiments, trying every which way to actually look into EVP. So I'm glad that he carried it on, because he had a lot of good things to say about it and some interesting things about where he couldn't find a conventional explanation and where he could. But that's all purposeful recording and trying to make machines. Telephone calls. Well, as far back as I can see, we've got a medium in Brazil, Oscar de Argonal, reporting in a book that translates to Voices from Beyond by Telephone. Oscar de Argonal claimed that they were having repeated conversations from the dead, but only via the telephone. That's how their mediumistic ability worked. They picked up the telephone, spoke to the dead, and believed the dead was manipulating electrons within the line to speak to them. Then because of Raymond Bayliss and his apprentice at the time, D. Scott Rogo, doing more EVP research, they had a few people that when they spoke to them talking about EVP, they said, oh, you're recording alleged messages of the dead? Well, this might interest you. I've heard of a case of someone speaking to the dead on the telephone. Maybe that's of interest to you. First 2 or 3 cases they had around 1976, they weren't interested at all. But then when they realized more and more people were reporting this, they thought, well, this is bizarre. We haven't seen anyone mention this in the parapsychological literature. Maybe we should start collecting these accounts and looking into how common it is and what's going on. So they did. That produced the book Phone Calls from the Dead. There was a follow-up study in Italy in 1984 by a medical doctor, Dr. Massimo Biondi, who's involved in parapsychology to this day. And then, as I mentioned, 2008, I got involved and started publishing some studies. So I mentioned this. This is Melton's study. This is his second device, how it was set up and what's involved in it. So we have all of these really basic elements, and then a balloon. What do you think is inside the balloon? Helium, water, what else? Any other answers on that? Air? What kind of air? Breath? Whose breath? Whoever blew it up? Who do you think he'd want to blow it up? If you remember what I mentioned about the story of the seance. Close. It was the sun himself. So he believed that the activity increased when the sun came into the room. So how am I going to make a device that incorporates my son in some way? So he had his son blow up the balloon. So it contains his breath, the psychic ether, mediumistic type breath, even though his son was quite skeptical. And he took this device about to various spiritualist churches, gave the headphones to people, and people believed they were having communication from the dead. Later on, he developed this further. He spoke to Harry Price about it, and the device had a speaker on the side as well, so people could actually, they didn't have to put the headphones on, a whole audience could listen to the messages. I wish I could see that device now and how it operated. Some people tried to make it themselves, and it didn't work. But you need to go to the original thing. Just because you replicate something, it's not the original thing. You've made a replica. You need the original device. Very briefly, Thomas Edison jumped on that bandwagon. So we had those 1919 reports, and he'd had an interview with Scientific American saying that he wanted to make one of these devices as well. And I think he really wanted to get that kind of patented. If people were genuinely doing this, imagine how that would be, commercializing something like that, a phone that you could buy that would contact the dead. He said in his interview, if our personality survives, then it is strictly logical and scientific to assume that it retains memory, intellect, and other faculties and knowledge that we acquire on this earth. Therefore, if personality exists after what we call death, it's reasonable to conclude that those who leave this earth would like to communicate with those that they have left here. 11 years later, he died. There is no machine that was created. The Thomas Edison Museum gets the highest reports of people calling them, asking for the blueprints or photographs of this device. They have to let everyone down because there aren't such things, even though over time, people have allegedly come forward saying that they've got the blueprints themselves or they've got a partially made device. So there's Raymond and there's Scott, and this is one of their lovely paperbacks. I love the book designs of the 1970s and 80s where you've got the cross and then the telephone lines going through the grave as well. So we have all these kind of beautiful, creepy paperbacks. But they got a lot of media fame. They ended up in newspapers. They'd gone on, was it a TV show called That's Incredible or That's Amazing? It was something like that over here. They'd gone on there talking about these experiences. And here's just a little clip about some of the media fame.
One man may have uncovered evidence that implies spirit communication may occur with remarkable frequency.
D. Scott Rogo is the author of Phone Calls from the Dead.
Well, I first heard about these cases when I first entered the field, which was close to 10, 12 years ago. And I really didn't take them seriously at all. I thought they were very outlandish. It was hard for me to believe that people were actually getting phone calls from people who were dead. But as the years progressed and I did more and more investigations, I discovered that these calls were fairly common. And then I realized that there was a major effect here that someone really had to study.
Mary Meredith of Oklahoma City recreates the night she purportedly received a phone call from the dead.
Hello? Of course, I don't tell everybody about it because a lot of people still think that I'm crazy when they even hear about it. But I know that it was, and it happened to me.
Mary Meredith's case occurred in 1977. She had just been in the hospital. She had returned to her home, not knowing that there was a letter waiting for her, telling her that her cousin had died. She had been very close to this cousin. It was very soon after she read this letter from her mother that the phone rang, and it was from her cousin.
It just really upset me when I got the phone call, and I hung up on the first phone call because it upset me. But when she called back again, I said, I cannot believe that anyone would call someone and tell them that it's their cousin when my cousin is dead. I can't believe this. I said, and I have been sick, and I can't believe anyone would pull something on me like this. She said, but I know you've been sick. I was at the hospital with you. And I said, what are you talking about? And the phone started getting crackling, and then I couldn't hear her. It just faded away.
The idea that the dead can contact the living through electromagnetic devices is certainly not new with my research. Thomas Edison, for instance, several years before his death, became very fascinated with the idea that he could invent a machine that could bring through the voices of the dead, and even apparently made some sketches of such equipment. Edison, as is well known, was extremely paranoid about his ideas and kept them very, very hidden, so he never patented his ideas. But certain sketches did surface after his death, which purported to be the machine he was working on.
Scott is the very reason that I'm also partly doing this trip as well. I wanted to come and speak to you again, but on Monday I'm going up to Hollywood to see his father. Jack Rogo is a Pearl Harbor veteran, so he's got some really interesting tales to tell. But Scott was murdered in his home in 1990, and there's so much more that I need to kind of learn about Scott. I want to write a bigger biography about what he did. He was a full-time parapsychologist. He spent his entire career writing. And so later next week, I'm off to San Francisco to go and look through his personal files. I've got 42 boxes to sift through at the California Institute of Integral Studies, and they haven't been opened really. No one's gone into those files. So I'll be looking up more about Scott, his personal life, and also some of this research as well. But it's because of what they were doing there that I wanted to actually continue with this research and look at how much of things changed. Raymond Bayliss published a lot on survival of death. Most of his books are around that, animal ghosts and things like that. Scott had done a variety of things. I even love the cover for this of ESP and Your Pet, where you're looking at a Xenocard and the cat has correctly picked a star. I love that with its paw on it. But he'd written about aliens and religious miracles such as weeping statues and stigmata and things like that. But Phone Calls from the Dead stood out as their most popular book, which saw 3 separate reprints. And then later on, Scott had written a chapter in his book about it, and Liz and Raymond, they'd also written a chapter in their book as well, The Case for Life After Death. But I couldn't really find much after that, these chapters that later occurred. And so I wanted to look into it. They discovered through looking at 50 cases that there were different types of calls. So you saw one that was mentioned there with Mary Meredith. The first and most simple call is known as a simple call, but it's limited conversation. You've lost someone, you're at home grieving, the telephone rings, you pick it up, and there's this distant voice, sounds very hollow. They're probably saying your name, or they're saying goodbye, but you recognize the voice and characteristics, and you don't hear the receiver go down. The voice just fades out. Prolonged calls, so like, well, not quite like Mary Meredith, because she was aware of her cousin being dead, but this would happen where you have a telephone call, happens for half an hour, and then afterwards you discover, knock at the door, Joe turns up, oh, did you hear about Susan? Oh, no, what's happened to Susan? She died yesterday in a car accident. She can't have done, I've just been speaking to her for half an hour. Those kinds of instances would occur. Type 3, answer calls. You are the one that makes the telephone call, and yet the person who you don't know is dead answers the call, and you have a long conversation. Or you have a call with someone who is nowhere near a telephone at a time, and it's corroborated later. So Raymond had this a few times. He would call Scott when they were aware of this phenomena, and Scott's flatmate would answer and say, well, Scott's not in, he's gone away for a few days. And Raymond will say, well, tell him I called and say it's urgent. As soon as he gets back, he needs to give me a call. And then 4 or 5 days would go by, and Raymond was quite annoyed that Scott hadn't called him back, so perhaps this message hadn't been passed on. And he'd call, Scott would answer, and he'd say, I'm really annoyed, I said it was urgent. Your flatmate needed to tell you this message straight away. I needed to speak to you a couple of days ago. And Scott would say, well, I haven't been away all that long, but my flatmate, no one was here. He's been away for a month. He's traveling. So no one's been in. And so they had that whole thing where this clash would happen. Raymond had spoken to the flatmate before, so he knew his characteristics, his knowledge, his personality. Mixed calls. I discovered this in my own analysis of 50 cases, that you could get people knowing that someone was dead and yet repeated conversations. The most kind of fantastical one that occurs regardless of what really happened, how it's being interpreted. It was a telephone call from the dead that happened for 3 years. In that, a guy who later became a doctor of social sciences, he remembers as an 11-year-old his mother repeatedly having calls from her deceased lover. The family had split up, the mother and father were still living in the same house, quite amicably, but they'd both gone off and got separate partners until they could decide what they were doing next. But her partner had passed away, and still she was receiving repeated telephone calls from her. The first one, she went white as a sheet when she discovered what had happened. But this was the 1960s, and you can't call the Ghostbusters. No one really knows that university departments exist interested in looking at this, so they just accepted it as the norm. 3 to 4 times a week, she would go off to the bathroom with trailing the landline cable in there and speaking to him for 15 to 20 minutes. She kept a 5-year diary, and the accounts of these calls are in there, and they're so repetitive. Thursday morning, my darling called to say that he loved me and would be at my side. He comes to me on the wind and says everything will be all right, and I feel better. It's over and over again. Very strange. If it is a prank call, it's one where someone's invested a lot of time and effort into it because of how repetitive it was, if they were trying to get to her for something that she'd done. Intention calls, and this would happen where you intend to make a telephone call, but then you never actually do, but the time you intended to, that call still carries out for the person that you wanted to call. So usually I'd hold my book and quote it chapter and verse, but I've read it so many times now I can tell you what happened, and Scott recounts his own instance, which is the clearest one, but they collected many others. So it was like, it was a bright Wednesday morning, and I was thinking of calling a colleague at the UCLA Neuropsychiatric Institute. It was about 10 a.m., but then I changed my mind and decided that I had some other paperwork that I needed to deal with, and I'd call them some other time. At around 4 o'clock that afternoon, I got the shock of my life when a call came in from the very department of the very psychologist I had thought about calling, and it was their assistant. The assistant said that he was answering my message. When I asked him blazes what he was talking about, he said that at 10 a.m. a call had come into them from me, and the person had left my name and my number and asked that the call be returned. So that was Scott's own instance. There were many other kinds like that received from people, and that's an intention call. So in the original study in 1979, they found that type 1 calls outweighed type 2 calls by 3 to 1. Oh, sorry, mine 3 to 1, the original study 4 to 1. And then my study 7 to 1 of calls from the dead outweighing calls from living people by 7 to 1 and 8 to 1 in the original. So quite close, even though they're only samples of 50. But like what I said with the ADCs, most of the calls occurred within a time of bereavement. And I found that some of my participants in my PhD could relate to these telephone calls, a lot of the time in dreams as well. Type 2 calls, less common, but some people had these prolonged ones. Only one instance of someone making a call and then realizing afterwards the person was dead. Some of these mixed calls where people were aware that the person was dead but still had repeated calls, they were less so. Some of these intention ones, they were equal. But I had loads of accounts that just didn't fit any of the bill, where people were reporting haunted houses that had ringing telephones, but no telephones in them. And people were going crazy actually trying to find the telephone to answer it, and they were even opening up cavities in the wall searching for cables or potential hidden telephones in the plasterboard. Or people having daydreaming about telephone calls and things like that, or text messages. So other things were occurring. Just so conscious of time because I've made this talk far longer than I anticipated, sorry. There were criticisms, we'll skip that out. I did a recent paper, if any of you are interested in the criticisms of the research, I did a long paper about why the methods were good and to the standards of social science, and some of the criticisms were really weak and quite emotionally driven, where people were making some really wide assumptions. I wanted to dig deeper into what was going on, so I hooked up with colleagues, Dr. Neil Dagnall and Dr. Ken Drinkwater at Manchester Metropolitan University. I've done a massive summary of some of the major papers that I've done and a big commentary and a portfolio that's to go into the SPR. And John Randall, the late John Randall, Liz met John Randall, he just said that somehow we need a way of separating what seems like ESP, because ESP could be causing these calls and many conventional things, from survival. I mean, first and foremost, John said, just remember, people by their very nature can be cruel. So don't ever rule out the idea that this is not a prank call. First and foremost, assume it might be. Or just a misinterpretation. Someone's lost a son or a daughter. How many people are called mum and dad? Loads of people are. And so someone dials a wrong digit and they think they've got their mum or dad, and someone suddenly starts crying down the phone because they think that it's their son or their daughter calling from beyond the grave. The person who made the call goes, ooh, puts the phone down, doesn't apologize and explain their mistake. But for the person that's received it, having lost a child, for them they might interpret it as a phone call from the dead. I'll finish on these theories. I mean, there are 4 different theories you could go into. First and foremost, they are, ignore all of that, I'll explain it. These are seeming like phone calls from the dead. So how far can we trust survival? Well, there are big arguments for this. Even to today, we've come up to a brick wall. There is a book called The Myth of the Afterlife, which is a massive anthology that's come out, and loads of major scientists have contributed to this, saying, as far as we understand neuroscience and how the brain works at the point that you die, all that mental activity has stopped. And so, that's it. These experiences can't happen. At the same time, the same publisher produced the book Beyond Physicalism, where loads of scientists who do believe in this idea that the mind and body can work separately, they said that, well, neuroscience actually helps out this idea of mind-body separation, but by saying that mental activity stops, you're not explaining the survival phenomena that I mentioned, multiple witnesses, veridical information, and so both of them have gone zoom and hit a brick wall. And so the problem with survival is we have all these instances suggestive of it, but no real good theory or mechanism to explain it. But you could also explain survival in terms of ESP and PK. Someone's presenting ESP or PK and it's producing the illusion of contact with the dead. You're longing for that person in a telephone call, psychokinetically the telephone rings, you pick it up, and then there's this hallucination of the person's voice over the top as well. These are ideas that have been battered about. I don't necessarily conform to them, I'm just saying they're worth considering. But first and foremost, we should be looking at anomalistic ideas. I must have listed recently at least a dozen conventional explanations that could occur for this before you even get into any of these. But after survival, after ESP and PK, we've got people like Professor Bernard Carr. He's one of Stephen Hawking's ex-students. He's vice president of the Society for Psychical Research. And he's talked about things such as hyperspace and ESP, multiverse theory. So we're so used to a 3-dimensional universe. We're okay to an extent with the idea of time and space, but he talks about the 10th and 11th dimension. Things that we can't even mentally really comprehend, and how we have all these ideas of multiple universes, and maybe there's no such thing as survival of death or psychic phenomena, but we have these overlaps sometimes that we as humans experience, sometimes a glimpse of other universes and other instances of us that could be. So that's why we might see apparitions of the living, people that could have done something but didn't. At every point they made a decision, they changed their mind, but we see the alternative decision play out, if that makes sense, like the intention calls. And so maybe multiple universes, hyperspace, that can actually explain a lot of psychic phenomena. So a lot of his writing's been on that, and I think to a large extent that could help us explain some survival phenomena, and it rules out a lot of ESP and other survival things. If you're really interested in the major criticisms of survival and where we really stand, Michael Sudduth has produced this book, a philosophical critique of empirical arguments post-mortem survival, and he takes all the major studies and major theories and just really sums up as a philosopher, where are we today, how good is this evidence? And not to spoil the book too much, he says in some parts it's good, but it's not great. We are lacking major consistent theories, even though there are some really good studies out there, which I'll talk about next with Alex Tannis. So, thank you very much. You need a break.